When We Disagree is a show about arguments, how we have them, why we have them, and their impact on our relationships and ourselves. Have you ever sat in a confusing lecture and looked around at everyone nodding along and just assumed you were the only one who was lost? Later, you discovered that everyone was confused. Nobody had any idea what this person was talking about, but they all thought they were alone too. This is called pluralistic ignorance, when everyone privately rejects a norm but thinks everyone else is accepting it. The social psychologist Floyd Allport identified this phenomenon in 1924, and it explains why groups often make decisions that nobody actually wants. Pluralistic ignorance creates bizarre disagreements where everyone argues for positions they don't really hold. The family just keeps going to the same restaurant every Sunday, even though each member secretly is bored and doesn't really like the restaurant. A team implements a policy where everyone becomes privately convinced is stupid, but nobody speaks up because everyone else seems like they're on board. We become prisoners of imaginary consensus. This dynamic happens in a friend group when everyone pretends to enjoy activities they've outgrown or tolerates someone's problematic behavior, assuming others are genuinely okay with it. In political discourse, pluralistic ignorance manufactures artificial polarization. People assume their neighbors hold more extreme views than they actually do, so they either silence or moderate their positions or amplify them to fit in. A community where 80% of people privately support compromise becomes gridlocked because everyone thinks they're surrounded by extremists. The silent majority stays silent because they think they're in the minority. Breaking pluralistic ignorance requires someone to speak first. One person saying, "I don't actually understand this," gives others permission to admit their own confusion. One family member suggesting a new restaurant reveals everyone's been pretending this whole time. Understanding this phenomenon helps us recognize when groups might be trapped in unwanted patterns. Sometimes the bravest thing to do in a disagreement is to admit uncertainty, discomfort, or disagreement. You might discover you're not alone. I'm Michael Lee, Professor of Communication and Director of the Civility Initiative at the College of Charleston. Our guest today on When We Disagree is Dan McCarthy. Dan is the editor of Modern Age Journal, which can be found at modernagejournal.com. Dan, tell us an argument story.
Well, right around the 2016 election, it was either shortly before or shortly after, I went and spoke at a university in the Midwest on the topic of civic engagement and democracy. And the argument that stuck with me is that many of the professors I encountered, and they were talking to students, they were talking on podcasts, they had a line which said that democracy is a straightforward process of learning the most you can about the candidates, then making a sort of rational decision between them, and you should be engaged by voting for one of the two major parties. You should never really contemplate either voting for a third party or writing in a candidate. And it seemed to me that the premises of this sort of argument or assumption on their part were actually quite false. And my own views were rather contrary, actually, to this, I think, very conventional picture of correct civic engagement and participation in democracy.
What was the alternative you were stressing?
Well, you can't say that people should be research. Oh, it's not easy to say people can simply research their way into knowing the best candidate, because of course, where do you stop? And if you take the argument seriously enough, you would say on their side that maybe you have to, do years and years of research in order to figure out the best candidate. It would seem to suggest that that this is a knowledge question as opposed to a question of either evaluating immediate data that are available to everyone or a matter of evaluating philosophical fundamentals. And it seems to me that actually almost all elections are referendums on the party in power. And really, anyone who is in the country is capable of knowing whether things are getting better or getting worse. And that's the key decision to make.
I'm not sure if this term had taken off yet in 2016, but it's certainly taken off now. It almost seems like this is a debate about the utility of doing your own research as a citizen.
It's weird because this is a rare example where, the people I'm criticizing would actually say you should do your own research, and that not only should you do it, but also they don't really have a natural limit to place upon this. And it would seem to be, if you think that you have to be an educated voter in order to be worthy of casting a vote, then the question is, well, why don't we restrict voting simply to people who have PhDs or who are experts in particular issues? If expertise is really the thing that democracy is meant to be maximizing for, then you would take that approach rather than having a mass electorate the way we do. So you can't possibly justify having universal suffrage on the basis of knowledge and expertise as being the thing that justifies democracy.
There's this dispute about the American founding, historians arguing about two foundings, that is, one, a kind of Jeffersonian small d democratic founding, one, a little bit more of an elitist, perhaps Madison, certainly Hamiltonian kind of a founding. And it seems like some of that dispute is being referenced here in your talk at this Midwestern University in 2016, with these professors having a kind of tacit faith in everyone's ability to access information, to criticize that information and separate the wheat from the chaff and what's good and what's bad information, and then vote for the candidate that best checks out. So,
well, I think,
go
yeah,
ahead.
you've really hit upon something important because actually, I think this rather conventional view that these academics were reflecting is, in a way, a kind of unexamined combination of both the elitist and the populist versions of democracy. So, on the elitist side, it says that this is fundamentally about knowledge and making the one correct decision. But then it also says that absolutely everyone can do this. And those
Uh-huh.
premises don't really match up very well because, of course, some people have much more time and many more resources to conduct research, and other people don't really have, such resources at all. And so, you have to choose, if you're going to make a consistent argument, I think you have to choose one way or the other. You can have universal suffrage, or you can have a rule by well-educated elites. But trying to combine the two winds up getting you into difficulties because then you say, well, what do you do if voters actually, first of all, are simply ignorant and haven't done the research? And what do you do if voters are lazy and don't want to do the research? Or if they do the research, but they don't come to the same conclusions that the experts have come to? So I think combining those elitist and populist elements into the conventional idea of how you have civic engagement and democracy actually winds up creating something which is a self-contradiction.
The other dispute this really reminds me of, and a lot of these arguments are rehearsals of or recreations of arguments in the 1920s between John Dewey and Walter Lippmann, with Walter Lippmann largely saying in Public Opinion and a few other works that there can be no such thing as what he called this omnicompetent citizen, that everybody inevitably thinks in terms of stereotypes, and we should, to some extent, just be ruled by experts and social scientists and let the rest of us be free to live our lives. And Dewey seems to largely agree with all of the criticisms that there is no omnicompetent citizen, that the public sphere, as he says, is in chote and is impossible to be born under these educational circumstances. But for him, democracy is the cure for all problems of democracy. And so we can only have faith that the populace amongst us can get a little better at making a little bit better decisions.
What's interesting about that is that both Dewey and Lippmann are coming from basically the same premise. They believe that there has to be a very high degree of expertise guiding society and guiding politics, whether
Right.
that's coming from a set of experts who are set apart from the people, or whether it comes from making the people, as you
Right.
say, omnicompetent.
Uh-huh.
And I think that premise is actually mistaken, that the people don't have to be omnicompetent. They just have to be competent enough to know, again, whether the direction of the country is getting better or worse, and who's actually in charge right now, and therefore whether they should endorse the way in which our current leaders have been taking us, or whether they should object to it. Now, admittedly, it would help perhaps to have a good rationale for why you think things are getting better or worse. There may be situations where things are getting worse in the short term, but they actually are necessary for the long-term health of the country. So there is a role to be played by a certain amount of education. I'm not denying that. But I'm saying
Yeah.
it's actually quite minimal, and it doesn't require the degree of omnicompetence or even high expertise, or even
Sure.
the degree of intense devotion to following politics that the most highly educated among us, and that included Lippmann and Dewey, and it includes today's academics, that all of them are overestimating exactly what's involved in politics. And what's really necessary is to make a good judgment about simply the people who are already ruling over you.
I think some of this also seems like a dispute over the nature of the public sphere and participation in the public sphere. And so to stretch out and tease out exactly what your argument entails, if you're saying that capable participation in politics really just requires kind of meeting a minimum threshold about whether or not the country is going in the right direction or the wrong direction, and we need the same or new leadership. But we exist in a very complicated public sphere where people very loudly are trying to manipulate whether I perceive the country to be going in the right direction or the wrong direction. And uneducated or ill-equipped to criticize the information I'm getting, then perhaps the country could be going in one direction, but I'm hearing voices saying it's going in a different direction, and I've been persuaded at best, manipulated at worst, into making a decision that's against my own interests.
Yeah, so again, it's interesting to me that I think that argument is something that a great many intellectuals automatically believe without examination. And I don't know that it really holds up very well because oftentimes highly educated persons are themselves extremely susceptible to manipulation. And it simply isn't the case that highly educated people are necessarily going to have a more accurate perception of reality or of the political situation in the country than the less educated do. Because sometimes, if you are highly educated, if you're very sophisticated, you will buy into ideological frameworks or various sophisticated narratives, which may actually, be internally consistent,
All
but
right.
are not consistent with the world outside your window. And I think if you are less educated, you may be misled in other ways, perhaps emotionally or else, or in other respects. But you're not going to fall for that particular set of intellectual, delusions. You see this with, the enthusiasm that intellectuals often have for socialism and for various schemes which seem to be, quite well thought through, but that in fact wind up being disastrous when they're attempted to be put into effect. So that's not to say that I think the people are always right, but it is to say that I don't know that the intellectuals and the elite are necessarily more right than the people. I think there's fallibility on all sides here.
When some of us are manipulable all of the time and all of us are manipulable some of the time, and with that in mind, then what is to guide all of us who are sinners, all of us who are imperfect, except to place some faith in some methodologically rigorous way to understand how the country is doing and how I should vote as such, not with the idea that I know more, therefore I'm a better person or more capable actor, that I'm manipulable just like you. And so it's not a faith in necessarily a class of person, but instead in the application of a method.
Well, even that, I think, is a little bit problematic as you've concluded it, because the application of a method, again, is something that tends to lend itself towards a certain amount of formality and sophistication, which is not really what you find among the mass voting electorate. I don't know that they have that kind of method, or at least not consciously.
Right.
What you said first, however, I think is exactly on track, that we are all sinners and we need to approach politics with a certain amount of humility. And what's required
Mm-hmm.
of the voter is, in
Mm-hmm.
fact, a certain degree of introspection about the state of the country and about whatever it is that they do know about the competing candidates. And by the way, it seems to me that this introspection can and sometimes should lead them to want to vote for some alternative to the two major parties. And even if that's not going to have an impact materially on the election, it can still be simply the right thing to do in terms of registering the appropriate response to perhaps a country that's being, misled both by Republicans and by Democrats. If you constantly simply endorse the very limited number of options that you're given, you're never going to have any other options. Now, I would have
Yeah.
other criticism to make of third parties. I think it's usually a silly idea to vote for them, but it's not something that should be written off in principle.
Yeah, it seems like there's two disputes that are being had there in this 2016, and we're kind of teasing out one dispute about citizen capability, so I'm going to stick with that one. But there is this other one about what is the outcome of, as you said, a certain degree of introspection, an interesting phrase I want to come back to. And should that be something that is tied to the existing two-party system or something that explores additional options? So let's put that in the parking lot for just a second and come back to this. This certain degree of introspection, I guess my question would be, where do voters get that?
That has to come from simply, the habit of character. So it's not
Mm,
so much an intellectual practice as it is simply one of, interacting with your fellow citizens and thinking about, what's happening in their lives as well as what's happening in one's own life. And in one's own life, what are you expecting from government? Are your expectations calibrated too high? Or are they perhaps too low? And clearly different people will have different responses to that. But it really is a matter of thinking through what it means to be an American, what it means to be a human being. Certainly, if you are of a religious background, what it means to be a Christian, what it means to be whatever your faith tradition might be, and to think about how all of these things fit together in terms of your decision in the voting booth.
yeah, I guess I'm trying to figure out the language to summarize this dispute as efficiently as possible. Because when I spin it through in my mind, sometimes I'm like, this doesn't seem like there's much of a gap here, but now I'm hearing a bigger gap. And so perhaps the one point of view is vote your values first and then use a kind of minimum threshold of information to figure out whether the current ruling climate is befitting your values, whatever those values are. And then that is a kind of minimum threshold for effective political participation. And the other one is a little bit more blank slate, right? You have value commitments, but you really need to figure out which candidate most thoroughly endorses those value commitments, which party, which policy, et cetera. And so there's a much higher participation threshold in terms of how much information you need to gather and sift.
Except I would say that I think you're still bringing this back to the idea that candidates, platforms, details are the things that are the substance of politics, whereas in fact it's really the more fundamental question of what is the state of the country? Are you being well served or ill served by the people who are in charge? And what has happened during the last interval between the previous election and the new one? And again, I think there's actually quite a lot of political science which says that certainly presidential elections tend to be referenda on the party in power. And people are simply saying, do I want to continue with the path that we're on by either re-electing the incumbent or electing the person following that person in the same party? Or do I think the country is in need of a change?
Right.
That's, I think, a very minimal standard, but it's a standard that actually mass democracy can meet. Whereas if you have a much more sophisticated standard, the question is why you would have democracy at all. And if you're going to have democracy, you're going to have to probably restrict it to highly educated persons. But again, if you're going to do that, then why have it at all, rather than simply saying what we actually need are not a mass of voters, even a restricted mass of voters, but rather the persons who know the specialties of politics, know the policy questions better than anyone else. And ultimately, you'd have a very small intellectual aristocracy that would be making those
Sure.
decisions, or perhaps not even an intellectual aristocracy. Why we should perhaps, just defer to, if there's a single individual who has the wisest possible
Right.
understanding, we should just all, defer despotically to, letting this person make our decisions for us because this is the wisest, best informed, most knowledgeable.
Right.
And in fact, and here, of course, here in the 21st century, what this will increasingly wind up turning into is an argument for letting artificial intelligence make the decisions for us. Because what human being can possibly process all this information as well as an information processing machine possibly can do?
Yeah, this is the electoral college at best, and despotism at worst, perhaps even a kind of artificial intelligence controlled despotism. And that really gets to the stakes of this dispute, which is where I wanted to turn to next, which is why does this argument about what we expect of people participating in a democracy matter? And I want to state your case as charitably as I can, and get your sense of whether we're getting it right or not, which is that what's at stake is that we overestimate the public's ability to participate in democracy at our peril, and continued overestimation of that participation can lead us naturally to conclude that maybe their participation is not possible at the threshold that we hope. And so instead, we should encourage people to continue to chat with their neighbors, to vote with their values, and to figure out, basically, as Reagan said in 80, are they better off now than they were 4 years ago?
I agree with the latter part of your statement there, but
Uh-huh.
actually not the former. So the problem is not simply that we overestimate what the public is capable of and that leads us off the rails in various ways.
Hmm.
It's rather that you have a disjunction and an animosity, an alienation that begins to set in between people who think of themselves as being highly educated and therefore capable of making the right decisions, and the larger volume of voters who not only don't have that knowledge, but also don't think that that knowledge is necessarily the thing that should be guiding their decisions. So you wind up with a conflict between two layers in American society. And that conflict winds up depriving, in some ways, the mass public of the kind of loyal service it should be getting from the intellectuals who, instead of telling people that they're not reading the newspaper often enough to make a decision,
Hmm.
the intellectuals should be saying, well, here's instead I'm going to make a case why you should perhaps read the newspaper, but more to the point, I'm going to argue that, you know what, I need to learn something from you just as you need to learn something from me. I need to learn something as an intellectual from the temper of the people and why they're coming to the conclusions they are, not just, tell them that they're wrong to be, voting for a candidate I don't like, or for not following the methodology that I think is appropriate for
Uh-huh.
deciding how they should vote.
I follow you. So there's in your mind, there's more of a kind of intellectual class war that's happening between a populist public and intellectuals. Those intellectuals, in your mind, need to be a bit more deferent to the organic knowledge that's generated from folks who don't have as many degrees as them.
Just so. And again, I would say that humility is one of the key ideas here. And what we've seen, I think, is that among our intellectual leadership in this country for, a generation or more, there hasn't been the appropriate degree of humility, and that's created a great deal of strife between intellectuals on the one hand, and intellectuals, I mean broadly. It's people who are, have college degrees and who generally have this, sort of immediate faith and expertise, this unexamined faith, I should say, in expertise, and who are not questioning their own fallibility, but instead tend to look at the fallibility of others. I'll just add, by the way, there is, of course, this, very awkward paradox where many of the people who are, progressive and who think that, maybe in a kind of Deweyite way that we can
Uh,
create this omnicompetent citizenry. There are also people who argue that, it's unthinkable that you could possibly have, various kinds of tests of whether people are well enough informed that they should be voting. And so, again, I think they are kind of hoisted on their own petard. They've got an argument where they have conflicting premises and they're not able to reconcile them. And so they wind up being very surprised, especially when voters that they think of as being willing to defer to the experts like themselves wind up not being willing to defer to them. So again, it creates a certain unnecessary level of strife because you have too much pride on the part of the more elite kind of citizen, whereas humility would actually serve them better. It would help them understand why voters are angry with them, perhaps, which is certainly where we find ourselves today.
Last question, and a big one to close on as well, which is that we are involved in a cultural dispute about the role of the expert as we speak. And social media certainly has enabled generations of podcasters and influencers who are certainly not experts in, let's say, science or democracy to hold forth and curry lots of public opinion and sway favors and so forth on these kinds of an issues. So there has kind of been for lack of a better word, an awakening of sources that people can listen to. And many are saying that we now live in the most anti-intellectual age, the most anti-expert age. And for them, of course, it's about rebirthing the role of the expert and the critic and so forth. What would you say about that debate? It seems, I think I hear you on one side of it, but I'm curious how you respond to the claim that we live in an anti-intellectual age and that's a bad thing.
Well, I think if we are living in an anti-intellectual age, it's because no, it's not rather because the public has suddenly taken a unreasonable animosity towards the intellectual elite, but rather the opposite. That you've had intellectuals who have become almost, like followers of Lysenko in the old Soviet Union. That we have, it may not be quite as clear cut in some respects as it was back in the days of the old Soviet Union, whether we're talking about biology or whether we're talking about economics. But even today, the ideas which have proliferated in higher education are often very detached from reality and, are often, incorrect, even according to their own frameworks. But the people who hold them are not necessarily examining them close enough. So again, I would just come back to this idea that intellectuals in their pride are sometimes dumber than the public because what they're doing is that they are sort of dazzled by their own verbal constructions, their own intellectual, sort of sandcastles, and they have a difficulty escaping that and realizing that the real world and certainly the social world in which most Americans live is quite, quite different from what they're thinking about in their own minds or reading about in their communications, their books, and and other kinds, their lectures and so forth, with people on the same intellectual level as themselves. So there needs to be more humility. There needs to be a sense of stepping outside and not, being within an intellectual construct all of one's life. Otherwise, you wind up with an intellectual class, which again, instead of serving the public, winds up feeling as if, winds up feeling frustrated because it sees its role as being a tutor and it's being ignored.
You edit Modern Age. I'm curious about how Modern Age and in your writing or in your editorship is practicing some of these principles of humility and charity that you talk about.
In a weird way, one of the ways you practice humility is not to take it for granted that you know where people should be categorized. So the nice thing about Modern Age is a scholarly intellectual quarterly. It goes back to the 1950s. It was founded by Russell Kirk. But it's a magazine with a public mission, and it's not simply for area experts. It's not simply devoted to politics or one particular field. It's rather an omnibus publication for the educated, or rather the intellectually engaged layperson. And that means that we appeal to academics, but we also appeal to anyone who wants to engage in the world of ideas. And that includes people who may be outside of the normal ambit of expertise within the university. So I think, we have one problem that emerges from this mutual misunderstanding between intellectuals and the mass public, is that the intellectuals underestimate what the public is capable of. It's not that the public is going to be herded through either a method or a set of intellectual commitments that the elite wants them to be herded through, but the public actually does include many people who take a personal interest in deepening their knowledge and engaging in the things that seem most important to them. And you should make information freely available to them. So I'm actually encouraged by the proliferation of different sources. It seems to me that trying to restrict information, trying to control it, is usually going to be counterproductive. And in fact, the best we can do is to say, here is, we're not simply going to let, the worst kind of, the most depraved material be the only thing out there. If you want to compete with the material that may be leading citizens astray, you have to make good material available just as freely as the bad material is.
Dan McCarthy, thank you so much for being on When We Disagree.
Thank you.
When We Disagree is recorded at the College of Charleston with creator and host Michael Lee. Recording and sound engineering by Jesse Kunz and Lance Laidlaw. Reach out to us at whenwedisagree@gmail.com.